They called her the quiet one at Miller's indoor range. What they didn't know was that Sarah Chun held the world record for precision shooting that had stood unbroken for 8 years. By the time they discovered the truth, she had already changed. 3 lives forever. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the concrete floor of Miller's indoor range. Sarah Chun sat alone at the far end of the facility, methodically cleaning her rifle with the same precision she applied to everything else in her life. The weapon was a custom-built .308 Winchester, its stock worn smooth from years of handling, its scope meticulously calibrated to tolerances that most shooters couldn't even comprehend. Around her, the Saturday afternoon crowd went about their business with the casual enthusiasm of weekend warriors. Men in tactical gear they'd never need, discussing modifications to weapons they'd never truly master. Women trying to impress dates with their basic understanding of firearm safety. Teenagers whose fathers had dragged them here for character building stood uncomfortably behind the firing line, flinching at every shot. Sarah observed them all with the detached interest of someone who had seen real combat, real consequence, real death. At 34, she possessed the kind of stillness that made people forget she was in the room. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, revealing a face that was pleasant but unremarkable. She wore plain jeans and a faded green t-shirt that hung loose on her small frame. Nothing about her appearance suggested that she had once been considered the most lethal sniper in the United States Marine Corps. The other regulars at Miller's had long since categorized her as harmless. Dave Morrison, who ran the pro shop, occasionally nodded in her direction but had never bothered to learn her name. To him, she was just the Asian woman who came in twice a week, shot by herself for exactly 2 hours, and left without speaking to anyone. Her targets were always the same, standard bullseyes at distances that any decent shooter could manage. She never participated in the weekend competitions, never joined the tactical training courses, never even engaged in the casual conversation that bound the shooting community together. What they didn't see was the way she read the wind patterns. From the subtle movement of dust motes in the air, they didn't notice how she calculated humidity, temperature, and barometric pressure without instruments. They couldn't comprehend that she was shooting deliberately imperfect groups, handicapping herself to avoid drawing attention, while still maintaining the muscle memory that had once made her legendary among those who knew. The range's regulars had their own hierarchy, an unspoken pecking order based on equipment, experience, and perceived skill. At the top was Marcus Webb, a former police officer who never tired of telling stories about his 20-year career in law enforcement. Webb carried himself with the swagger of someone who believed his service revolver had made him an expert on all things related to firearms. His voice carried across the range as he held court near the rifle benches, explaining to anyone who would listen the finer points of tactical shooting. Most people don't understand the psychological pressure of shooting under stress, Webb was saying to a small group of admirers. When someone's shooting back at you, when lives are on the line, that's when you separate the real marksman from the weekend warriors. He gestured toward the far end of the range where Sarah sat quietly. Take someone like that little lady over there. Probably shoots nice tight groups at 25 yards, thinks she's Annie Oakley. But put her in a real situation, and she'd fold like a cheap suit. The comment drew chuckles from his audience, men who nodded knowingly despite having never faced anything more dangerous than a paper target. Sarah heard every word but didn't react. She'd learned long ago that the loudest voices in any room were rarely attached to the most dangerous people. Webb's type were common in her world, men who confused volume with authority, who mistook aggression for competence. Behind the counter, Dave Morrison's son Jake worked the afternoon shift, processing ammunition sales and rental fees with the bored efficiency of someone who had grown up around firearms, but never developed a passion for them. Jake was 22, fresh out of college, and clearly marking time until something better came along. He'd inherited his father's business sense, but none of his enthusiasm for the shooting sports. To Jake, the range was a collection of customers, with varying levels of disposable income. Nothing more. The afternoon crowd included the usual mix of suburban professionals seeking stress relief, collectors showing off their latest acquisitions, and serious competitors preparing for upcoming matches. There was Tom Rodriguez, a machinist who had built his own precision rifle and spent hours perfecting handloads in pursuit of the perfect group. Sandra Williams, a real estate agent who had taken up shooting after a break-in at one of her properties, now competed regularly in women's divisions. The Hendricks brothers, twins who ran a small construction company and treated the range like their personal social club. None of them paid much attention to Sarah, and that was exactly how she preferred it. She had chosen Miller's indoor range specifically because it was unremarkable, a place where she could maintain her skills without drawing the scrutiny that had defined her military career. The facility itself was nothing special, a converted warehouse with 25 shooting lanes, basic ventilation, and equipment that was functional rather than cutting edge. It served her purposes perfectly. Sarah's routine was always the same. She arrived at exactly 2 o'clock, checked in with minimal conversation, and made her way to lane 23, the farthest from the main traffic flow. She shot exactly 100 rounds in predetermined patterns, focusing on different aspects of marksmanship fundamentals: breathing, trigger control, sight alignment, follow-through. The same building blocks that had once made her the most feared sniper in 3 theaters of combat. Her targets told a story that no one at Miller's could read. The seemingly random groupings actually represented complex shooting problems that she was constantly solving and resolving, shooting with her offhand to maintain ambidextrous skills. Rapid target acquisition drills disguised as casual plinking. Precision shooting at distances that appeared routine, but required calculations that would challenge most professional marksmen. The rifle she used was a masterpiece of precision engineering, though it appeared to be nothing more than a well-maintained hunting gun. The barrel had been hand-lapped to tolerances measured in 10,000ths of an inch. The trigger broke at exactly 2 pounds with no creep or over-travel. The stock had been bedded with a precision that eliminated any possibility of movement under stress. The scope, while appearing to be a standard hunting model, was actually a custom-built precision instrument, capable of tracking targets at distances that would astonish the weekend warriors around her. But Sarah kept all of this hidden, shooting groups that were good enough to be respectable, but not so good as to attract attention. She had learned to miss intentionally, to place shots in patterns that suggested competence rather than mastery. It was a skill that required almost more discipline than shooting perfectly, the ability to deliberately perform below her capabilities while maintaining the edge that had once made her lethal. The transformation from Staff Sergeant Sarah Chun, USMC Scout Sniper, to the quiet woman at Miller's indoor range had been gradual and painful. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq, and 1 classified deployment that officially never happened had left her with a collection of decorations she kept in a box and memories she couldn't file away so easily. The Marine Corps had given her purpose, identity, and a level of skill that few humans ever achieved. When she left the service, she had taken with her a world record that was classified and a reputation that existed only in the whispered conversations of those who had witnessed her work. The civilian world had no place for someone with her particular set of skills. Job interviews had been exercises in translation, attempting to explain how her military experience applied to positions that seemed trivial by comparison. She had eventually found work as a security consultant, a job that paid well, but left her feeling like she was sleepwalking through her days. The shooting range had become her sanctuary, the only place where she could touch the person she used to be without fully awakening the memories that came with it. Her record had been set during a classified operation in the mountains of Afghanistan. A single shot at a distance that officially never happened against a target that was never confirmed. The Army had been attempting to break the Marine Corps' long-standing dominance in precision shooting, and they had brought their best marksmen to witness what they believed would be an impossible shot. Sarah had taken the rifle, calculated the environmental factors, and fired once. The target had dropped at a distance that redefined what was considered possible in the field of precision shooting. The Army marksman had protested, demanded verification, and insisted that the shot had been luck rather than skill. Sarah had reloaded and fired again, placing the second shot within inches of the first. The silence that followed had been complete, broken only by the sound of the spent brass hitting the ground. The record had been classified immediately, the witnesses sworn to secrecy, and Sarah had been quietly transferred to a training position where her skills could be utilized without creating political complications. Now, 3 years after leaving the Corps, she maintained those skills in solitude, shooting her deliberately imperfect groups while the civilian world buzzed around her, unaware that they were in the presence of someone who had redefined the possible. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had become invisible through the very skill that had once made her legendary. In a world where everyone wanted to be seen, she had mastered the art of hiding in plain sight. The afternoon was winding down, the crowd beginning to thin as dinner time approached. Sarah finished her last series of shots, a group that appeared to be the work of a competent but unremarkable shooter. She began the process of cleaning her rifle, the ritual that marked the end of every session. Around her, the weekend warriors packed up their gear, already planning their next visit, their next purchase, their next chance to feel dangerous in a world that had forgotten what real danger looked like. The truth about Sarah Chun's past lived in the silence between her controlled breathing and the perfect trigger breaks that no one at Miller's indoor range had ever witnessed at full capacity. While Marcus Webb pontificated about tactical shooting and the weekend warriors debated the merits of different ammunition brands, Sarah methodically disassembled her rifle with movements that spoke of thousands of hours of practice under conditions they couldn't imagine. Her fingers moved across the weapon's components with the unconscious precision of a concert pianist, checking for wear, carbon buildup, and the microscopic imperfections that could mean the difference between a successful mission and catastrophic failure. This wasn't the casual maintenance routine of a hobbyist. This was the obsessive attention to detail that had kept her alive through 7 deployments and made her the most effective sniper in Marine Corps history. The rifle itself told a story that only another professional would understand. What appeared to be a standard hunting weapon was actually a precision instrument worth more than most people's cars. The barrel had been manufactured by a small shop in Montana that specialized in creating components for military and law enforcement snipers. The action had been blueprinted and tried to tolerances that eliminated any possibility of mechanical error. The stock had been custom fitted to her exact measurements, accounting for the way she held the weapon, the length of her arms, and the angle of her cheek against the rest. Every modification had been made for a specific purpose, each component selected to enhance her natural abilities rather than compensate for shortcomings. The trigger, set to break at exactly 2 pounds with no over-travel, matched her finger strength perfectly. The scope rings had been lapped to eliminate any possibility of movement under recoil. The muzzle brake had been designed to reduce not just recoil, but the specific harmonics that could affect bullet flight at extended ranges. Sarah had spent 3 years after leaving the Marines perfecting this weapon, driven by the same obsessive attention to detail that had made her legendary in combat. Every evening after her mundane day job, she would return to her apartment and work on some aspect of the rifle's performance. loading custom ammunition with powder charges measured to the tenth of a grain, testing different bullets to find the perfect combination of weight, ballistic coefficient, and terminal performance, recording environmental data and calculating ballistic solutions for every possible scenario she might encounter. The apartment itself reflected her military background in ways that civilian visitors would never notice. The furniture was arranged to provide clear sight lines to all entrances. The windows were covered with blinds that could be adjusted to provide concealment while maintaining observation capabilities. Her closet contained clothing in neutral colors that wouldn't stand out in any environment. The kitchen cabinets held enough non-perishable food to sustain her for weeks without resupply, but it was the basement that revealed the true extent of her dedication to maintaining her skills. She had converted the space into a training facility that would have impressed professional instructors. One wall was lined with reference books on ballistics, meteorology, and advanced marksmanship techniques. Another contained maps of every major city within a 500-mile radius, marked with potential shooting positions and escape routes. A third wall held her awards and commendations, the physical evidence of a career that had redefined what was possible in the field of precision shooting. The centerpiece of the basement was a shooting simulator that she had constructed using military-grade components. The system could replicate any environmental condition, from the thin air of high altitude to the heat shimmer of desert combat. She spent hours each week running through scenarios that pushed her skills to their limits, maintaining the edge that had once made her the most feared sniper in 3 theaters of combat. Her daily routine began at 4:30 in the morning with a physical training regimen that would have challenged active-duty Marines. 2 hours of running, calisthenics, and strength training designed to maintain the physical conditioning that precision shooting demanded. Breakfast was consumed while reviewing meteorological data and ballistic calculations. The drive to her civilian job provided time to observe traffic patterns, note changes in the urban environment, and maintain the situational awareness that had kept her alive in combat. The job itself was a necessary evil, a way to maintain her cover while earning enough money to fund her real passion. As a security consultant for a mid-sized corporate firm, she reviewed threat assessments, updated emergency protocols, and provided training that her colleagues assumed came from basic military experience. They had no idea that her knowledge of small unit tactics, urban warfare, and counter-surveillance techniques came from operations that remained classified and experiences that had shaped the way special operations forces approached their missions. Co-workers saw her as competent but unremarkable, someone who did her job well without drawing attention to herself. She arrived early, left on time, and contributed to meetings without dominating them. Her reports were thorough and professional. Her recommendations sound but not revolutionary. She had mastered the art of being invisible in plain sight, a skill that had served her well in combat and served her even better in civilian life. The transformation from Staff Sergeant Sarah Chun to the quiet woman at Miller's Indoor Range had required more than just changing her environment. It had required her to fundamentally alter her relationship with her own abilities. In the Marines, her skill had been her identity, the thing that defined her worth and determined her place in the hierarchy. Every shot had been measured, every group size recorded, every improvement celebrated by her peers and superiors. Now, she deliberately shot groups that were good enough to be respectable, but not so good as to attract attention. This required almost more discipline than shooting perfectly, the ability to intentionally miss while maintaining the muscle memory and mental focus that had once made her legendary. She would fire 9 perfect shots and then deliberately pull the 10th, creating groups that suggested competence rather than mastery. The psychological cost of this deception was significant. Every deliberately imperfect shot felt like a betrayal of her training, her dedication, and the Marines who had trusted her with their lives. But she had learned through painful experience that revealing her true capabilities in civilian settings led to questions she couldn't answer, attention she couldn't handle, and expectations she couldn't meet without exposing the classified nature of her service. Her record had been set during Operation Enduring Freedom, a single shot that had eliminated a high-value target at a distance that redefined what was considered possible in the field of precision shooting. The target had been a Taliban commander who had been orchestrating attacks against coalition forces from a position that was considered unreachable by conventional means. Previous attempts to neutralize him had failed, and his continued presence was costing American lives. The shot had been taken from a ridge position at a distance that exceeded the previous record by nearly 400 yards. The environmental conditions had been challenging: high altitude, variable winds, and extreme temperature differentials between the sun and shadow. Sarah had spent 6 hours calculating the ballistic solution, accounting for factors that most marksmen never considered: the Coriolis effect caused by the Earth's rotation, the difference in air density between her position and the target, the ballistic coefficient of the specific lot of ammunition she was using. When she finally fired, the bullet had traveled for nearly 4 seconds before reaching its target. During that time, she had to account for the target's movement, the wind's effect on the bullet's trajectory, and the complex physics that governed projectile flight at extended ranges. The shot had been perfect, striking the target exactly where she had aimed and eliminating a threat that had been considered untouchable. The Army marksmen who had witnessed the shot had been stunned into silence. They had brought their best shooters to observe what they believed would be an impossible attempt, planning to use Sarah's failure to advance their own agenda within the military shooting community. Instead, they had witnessed a demonstration of skill that challenged their understanding of what was possible. The verification process had been extensive. The distance had been measured using military-grade laser rangefinders and confirmed by GPS coordinates. The environmental conditions had been documented by meteorological instruments. The target had been photographed before and after the shot, providing undeniable proof of the hit. The bullet's trajectory had been calculated and verified by ballistics experts who confirmed that the shot had been technically perfect. The political implications had been immediate and complex. The Marines had achieved something that the Army had been attempting for years, and they had done it with a relatively unknown staff sergeant who had no political connections or institutional support. The record had been classified to prevent it from becoming a source of inter-service rivalry, and Sarah had been quietly transferred to a training position where her skills could be utilized without creating further complications. But the knowledge of what she had accomplished remained with her, a source of pride and burden that she carried into civilian life. She had proven that the limits of human capability were higher than anyone had imagined, that with the right combination of skill, dedication, and conditions, a single person could reach out and touch targets at distances that seemed impossible. The record stood officially unbroken because it officially didn't exist, but Sarah knew that she had achieved something that no other human had ever accomplished. Now, 3 years later, she maintained those skills in secret, shooting her deliberately imperfect groups while the civilian world continued its business around her. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had become invisible through the very skill that had once made her legendary. In a world where everyone wanted to be seen, she had mastered the art of hiding in plain sight, carrying a secret that could never be shared and maintaining abilities that could never be fully demonstrated. The cost of this secrecy was measured not just in the shots she deliberately missed, but in the isolation it created. She couldn't form meaningful relationships with people who didn't understand her background. She couldn't pursue careers that would utilize her skills. She couldn't even engage in casual conversation about her hobbies without risking exposure. The shooting range had become her only connection to the person she used to be, and even there, she was forced to pretend to be someone else. The barriers that kept Sarah Chun's true abilities hidden weren't built from steel or concrete, but from assumptions, regulations, and the comfortable certainty that extraordinary talent always announced itself. At Miller's indoor range, the unofficial hierarchy had crystallized over years of Saturday afternoons and casual conversations, creating an environment where someone like Sarah could remain invisible, not through any deliberate conspiracy, but through the simple human tendency to see what was expected rather than what was actually there. The range's social structure reflected broader civilian attitudes toward military service and gender roles in ways that its members would have denied if confronted directly. Veterans were automatically assumed to have basic firearms competency, but the nature of their service was rarely questioned beyond surface-level pleasantries. Women were welcomed as participants, but subtly discouraged from positions of technical authority. Age and appearance trumped actual experience in determining who received respect and attention. Marcus Webb had established himself as the range's unofficial expert, not through demonstrated skill, but through consistent presence and confident assertions. His 20 years in law enforcement provided him with enough credibility to support his claims, and his willingness to offer advice on everything from ammunition selection to shooting stance gave him a platform that others were reluctant to challenge. The fact that his actual marksmanship scores were mediocre became irrelevant when measured against his ability to dominate conversations and project authority. Webb's influence extended beyond casual advice into the range's formal activities. When new members sought instruction, they were typically directed to him or to instructors he had recommended. When equipment purchases were being considered, his opinion carried significant weight. When disputes arose about rules or procedures, his interpretation was usually accepted without question. He had become the range's de facto leader through persistence and presentation rather than actual expertise. The range's management structure reinforced these dynamics in ways that seemed natural and inevitable. Dave Morrison, the owner, had built his business around serving recreational shooters who wanted to feel competent and confident. His instructors were selected for their ability to work with nervous beginners and weekend enthusiasts, not for their capacity to recognize or develop exceptional talent. The range's programs focused on basic safety, fundamental marksmanship, and the kind of tactical training that appealed to suburban professionals seeking excitement. Advanced shooting disciplines were discouraged, not through explicit policy, but through the absence of facilities and programs that would support them. The range's maximum distance was limited to 50 yards, eliminating the possibility of long-range precision shooting. The targets were standard bullseyes that revealed little about a shooter's actual capabilities. The timing systems were basic, making it impossible to measure the kind of rapid precision that separated professionals from amateurs. Sarah had chosen Miller's specifically because of these limitations, recognizing that they would help her blend in with the recreational shooting community. But she had also discovered that the range's culture actively discouraged the kind of performance that would have immediately identified her as someone with professional training. Shooting too well was considered showing off. Asking technical questions was seen as pretentious. Demonstrating knowledge of advanced techniques was viewed as threatening to the established order. The gender dynamics at Miller's were particularly complex, reflecting broader social attitudes that had evolved significantly but still contained underlying assumptions about women's roles in traditionally male-dominated activities. Female shooters were welcomed and encouraged, but their participation was often framed in terms of personal protection rather than competitive achievement. Women who shot well were praised for their dedication and natural talent, but rarely acknowledged as potential experts or instructors. Sarah had observed these patterns during her first weeks at the range, noting how female shooters were typically grouped together regardless of their actual skill levels, how their equipment choices were questioned more frequently than those of male shooters, and how their achievements were often attributed to luck or exceptional instruction rather than personal capability. The assumption that women were inherently less suited to precision shooting wasn't stated explicitly, but it permeated the culture in ways that made it difficult for exceptional female talent to be recognized or developed. The range's approach to military veterans reflected similar blind spots. Veterans were respected for their service and assumed to have basic firearms competency, but the nature of their military experience was rarely explored in depth. The assumption was that military training focused on combat applications rather than precision shooting, and that veterans would need to adapt their skills to civilian marksmanship standards. The possibility that a veteran might have received training that exceeded anything available in the civilian world was rarely considered. Sarah had encountered this assumption repeatedly during her early visits to Miller's. Well-meaning members had offered to help her transition from military to civilian shooting, assuming that her Marine Corps' experience had focused on rapid fire and close-quarters combat. When she had mentioned her interest in precision shooting, the response had been encouraging but condescending, with suggestions that she might enjoy the range's monthly precision challenge once she had developed more experience with accurate shooting. The range's equipment policies reflected these attitudes in ways that seemed reasonable but effectively limited what advanced shooters could accomplish. Custom ammunition was discouraged due to liability concerns, forcing shooters to use factory loads that might not match their weapons' capabilities. Modifications to rental firearms were prohibited, preventing shooters from demonstrating how proper equipment setup could improve performance. The range's chronograph was available only during specific hours and required advance reservation, making it difficult to conduct the kind of detailed ballistic testing that serious shooters required. These policies had been developed with the best intentions, designed to protect the business from liability while serving the needs of recreational shooters. But they had the unintended consequence of creating an environment where exceptional talent was difficult to recognize and nearly impossible to develop. A world-class shooter using suboptimal equipment and ammunition would produce results that appeared merely competent, while a mediocre shooter with expensive gear might appear more skilled than they actually were. The range's training programs reflected similar limitations. The basic marksmanship courses focused on safety and fundamental techniques, topics that Sarah had mastered before most of the instructors had started shooting. The advanced courses covered tactical applications that were watered-down versions of military training she had received years earlier. The precision shooting workshops addressed techniques that she had moved beyond during her first year as a Marine sniper. Sarah had attended several of these courses during her early months at Miller's, partly to maintain her cover and partly to observe how civilian instruction compared to military training. The experience had been enlightening in ways that had nothing to do with marksmanship. She had watched experienced shooters struggle with concepts that seemed elementary, seen instructors teach techniques that were outdated or ineffective, and observed how the civilian shooting community had developed its own mythology about what constituted expert performance. The most revealing aspect of these courses had been the way they approached the mental aspects of precision shooting. Military sniper training emphasized the psychological preparation required to perform under extreme stress, the meditation techniques that allowed for perfect focus during critical moments, and the mental conditioning that separated professionals from amateurs. Civilian instruction touched on these topics, but treated them as optional enhancements rather than fundamental requirements. Sarah had realized that the gap between military and civilian shooting wasn't just about equipment or techniques, but about the entire approach to developing human potential. The military system assumed that individuals could be trained to perform at levels that seemed impossible, and then provided the resources and instruction necessary to achieve those levels. The civilian system assumed that individuals had natural limitations that could be improved but never transcended. This philosophical difference had profound implications for how talent was recognized and developed. In the military, exceptional performance was actively sought out and rewarded, with the best shooters identified early and given opportunities to develop their skills further. In the civilian world, exceptional performance was often viewed with suspicion, seen as either luck or the result of advantages that others didn't possess. The range's competitive programs reflected these attitudes in ways that seemed designed to prevent rather than encourage exceptional performance. The monthly Precision Challenge used targets and distances that required competence rather than mastery. The annual championship was structured to reward consistency over excellence, with scoring systems that compressed the performance gap between skilled and exceptional shooters. The prizes were modest, suggesting that winning was less important than participation. Sarah had participated in several of these competitions during her first year at Miller's, shooting well enough to place respectably, but not so well as to attract unwanted attention. The experience had been frustrating in ways that had nothing to do with her actual performance. She had watched shooters with excellent fundamental skills struggle with mental pressure, seen competitors make equipment choices that undermined their capabilities, and observed how the scoring systems discouraged the kind of risk-taking that separated champions from participants. The most troubling aspect of these competitions had been the way they reinforced the range's social hierarchy. Winners were typically drawn from the same group of established members, men who had been shooting at Miller's for years and who had developed their skills within the range's cultural constraints. Newcomers, regardless of their actual abilities, were expected to work their way up through the system gradually, proving their worth through consistent attendance and social integration rather than demonstrated performance. This system had worked well for recreational shooters who wanted to improve their skills gradually, while enjoying the social aspects of the shooting community. But it had also created an environment where exceptional talent was likely to be overlooked, especially if it came from unexpected sources. A quiet woman who shot alone and avoided social interaction would have little opportunity to demonstrate her capabilities, even if those capabilities far exceeded anything the range had ever seen. The barriers that kept Sarah's abilities hidden weren't malicious or deliberately discriminatory, but they were real and effective. They had been created by well-meaning people who wanted to build an inclusive and supportive shooting community, but who had inadvertently constructed a system that rewarded conformity over excellence and social integration over individual achievement. The result was an environment where the most skilled shooter in the building remained invisible, her world record unknown and her capabilities unrecognized. The emergency began with what sounded like a routine call over the range's public address system. All shooters, please cease fire and step back from the line. We have a situation developing outside the facility. Dave Morrison's voice carried the controlled tension that suggested something more serious than a simple safety drill or equipment malfunction. The sudden silence that followed was broken only by the hum of the ventilation system and the distant sound of sirens growing closer. Sarah's instincts, honed by years of combat experience, immediately shifted into a different mode of awareness. While the other shooters around her seemed confused and mildly annoyed by the interruption, she was already processing the acoustic signature of the approaching emergency vehicles, estimating their number and type based on the sound patterns. Multiple units, including what sounded like tactical response vehicles. This wasn't a medical emergency or a simple police call. Through the range's windows, she could see the first police cars arriving in the parking lot, their red and blue lights painting the late afternoon sky in urgent colors. The officers who emerged moved with the purposeful haste of people responding to an active threat, not the measured pace of routine law enforcement. Their weapons were drawn, their formation tactical, their attention focused on the office building across the street from Miller's indoor range. The building in question was a mid-rise structure that housed several small businesses, including a tax preparation service, a dental office, and a small law firm. Sarah had noted it during her initial reconnaissance of the area, categorizing it as a low-threat environment with good sightlines and multiple egress routes. Now, as she watched police officers establishing a perimeter around the building, she realized that her assessment had been incomplete. Marcus Webb, true to form, immediately positioned himself near the windows to observe the developing situation. "Looks like we got ourselves a hostage situation," he announced to anyone within earshot, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had dealt with similar scenarios during his law enforcement career. "See how they're setting up the perimeter? Classic containment strategy. They'll probably call in the SWAT team next." As if summoned by his prediction, a black tactical vehicle rounded the corner and took position near the building's main entrance. Sarah watched as heavily armed officers emerged and began establishing communication equipment. The scene was unfolding with the methodical precision of a well-rehearsed operation, but she could see signs of stress in the officers' movements that suggested the situation was more complex than a standard hostage call. The range's other patrons had gathered near the windows, their afternoon shooting session forgotten in favor of the real-world drama playing out before them. Tom Rodriguez speculated about the type of weapons the suspect might have. Sandra Williams wondered aloud about the people who might be trapped inside. The Hendricks brothers debated whether they should evacuate the range or wait for official instructions. Sarah remained at her shooting position, methodically packing her equipment while maintaining awareness of the developing situation. Her years of experience had taught her that the most dangerous moments in any crisis often came from unexpected complications, and she wanted to be prepared for rapid movement if the situation escalated beyond the police department's ability to contain it. The first indication that this wasn't a routine hostage situation came when Sarah heard the distinctive crack of a high-powered rifle echoing from the direction of the office building. The sound was followed immediately by the crash of breaking glass and the urgent shouts of police officers repositioning themselves behind cover. The shot had come from an elevated position, suggesting that the suspect had access to the building's upper floors and was using them as a tactical advantage. "Jesus Christ," Webb muttered, his earlier confidence replaced by genuine concern. "That sounded like a .308. Whoever's in there has some serious firepower." The other shooters pressed closer to the windows, their curiosity overriding their common sense as they tried to get a better view of the action. Sarah's mind automatically began calculating the ballistics of the shot she had heard. The acoustic signature suggested a heavy-caliber rifle, probably a hunting weapon or possibly a military surplus firearm. The trajectory, based on the angle of the broken glass she could see, indicated a shooter positioned on the building's third or fourth floor. The accuracy of the shot, which had appeared to target a specific police vehicle, suggested someone with at least basic marksmanship training. A second shot rang out, this one striking the pavement near a group of officers who had been attempting to advance to a better position. The officers immediately fell back, their tactical formation broken by the realization that they were facing a shooter with both elevated position and sufficient skill to place shots with dangerous accuracy. The situation had evolved from a containment operation to an active sniper engagement. Sarah could see the frustration and concern on the officers' faces as they realized they were dealing with a threat that exceeded their standard training and equipment. Local police departments were well prepared for close-quarters hostage situations, but few had extensive experience with long-range precision shooting. The shooter's elevated position and apparent skill created a tactical problem that would require specialized knowledge to solve. The range's PA system crackled to life again as Dave Morrison's voice filled the building. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've been advised by the police that we need to evacuate the premises immediately. Please gather your personal belongings and proceed to the rear exit in an orderly fashion. Do not go near the front windows or the main entrance." The announcement triggered a wave of nervous activity as the shooters began collecting their equipment and moving toward the back of the building. Sarah noted that most of them were struggling with the transition from curious observers to potential targets. Their earlier fascination with the police operation replaced by the recognition that they were now in a potentially dangerous situation. As the group moved toward the rear exit, Sarah caught a glimpse of the tactical team's command post through one of the side windows. She could see officers clustered around radio equipment, their body language suggesting frustration and urgency. Maps and building schematics were spread across the hood of a police vehicle, and she could hear fragments of radio traffic discussing the need for specialized personnel and equipment. The third shot came just as the group reached the rear exit, and this one was different from the previous two. Instead of the sharp crack of a rifle, Sarah heard the distinctive sound of breaking glass followed by what sounded like a scream. The shot had found a target, and the urgency in the police radio traffic immediately increased. "We need medical assistance at the north perimeter," she heard an officer calling over his radio. "Officer down, repeat, officer down. We need to get a medic in there now, but we can't advance under current conditions." The situation had escalated beyond property damage and intimidation to actual casualties. Sarah realized that the police were facing a tactical nightmare, a skilled shooter in an elevated position who could control the entire area around the building, preventing rescue operations and forcing the tactical team to operate under severe constraints. Through the rear windows of the range, she could see additional emergency vehicles arriving, including what appeared to be a mobile command center and several ambulances. The response was growing larger and more complex, but the fundamental problem remained unchanged. The shooter's position and apparent skill created a tactical advantage that conventional police tactics weren't designed to overcome. As the group exited the range through the rear door, Sarah could hear Webb explaining the situation to anyone who would listen. "What they need is a counter-sniper," he was saying, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had watched enough police dramas to consider himself an expert. "Someone who can take that guy out from long range before he hits anyone else." The comment struck Sarah as both accurate and tragically ironic. Webb was correct that the situation called for specialized long-range shooting skills, but he had no idea that the person with those skills was standing right next to him. The police were struggling with a tactical problem that she could solve in minutes, but her cover and the classified nature of her abilities made it impossible for her to offer assistance. The evacuation area was a parking lot behind the range, separated from the main action by the building, but close enough that everyone could still hear the radio traffic and occasional shouting from the command post. Sarah positioned herself where she could observe the police operation while maintaining the appearance of a concerned civilian waiting for the all-clear. The fourth shot came 20 minutes later, and this one was followed by the sound of multiple sirens as additional medical personnel rushed to the scene. Sarah could see the strain on the faces of the tactical team leaders as they realized that their standard procedures were inadequate for the threat they were facing. The shooter was systematically degrading their operational capability while remaining essentially invulnerable to conventional response tactics. A police lieutenant approached the evacuated group, his expression grim as he prepared to deliver what was obviously unwelcome news. "I'm Lieutenant Patterson with the county tactical team," he announced. "We're going to need you folks to remain here for a while longer. The situation is still developing, and we can't guarantee safe passage out of the area until we've resolved the threat." The announcement triggered a wave of anxious questions from the evacuated shooters. How long would they have to wait? Was it safe where they were? What exactly was happening in the building? Patterson answered what he could, but Sarah could see that he was struggling with the same fundamental problem that was plaguing the entire operation. They were dealing with a threat that exceeded their training and equipment. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah watched the police operation with growing frustration. She could see officers taking unnecessary risks because they didn't understand the ballistics of long-range shooting. She observed tactical movements that exposed personnel to unnecessary danger. She listened to radio traffic that revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of how to counter a skilled Shooter in an elevated position. The situation was deteriorating in ways that the police couldn't seem to recognize. The shooter was learning their patterns, adapting to their tactics, and growing bolder with each successful shot. What had begun as a defensive position was evolving into an active hunting scenario, with the police officers becoming targets rather than responders. Sarah realized that she was witnessing the kind of tactical nightmare that she had been trained to prevent. A skilled shooter with good positioning and adequate equipment could control a significant area indefinitely, forcing conventional forces to operate under severe constraints while picking off targets of opportunity. The police were brave and well-intentioned, but they were fighting an enemy whose capabilities exceeded their training. The fifth shot shattered the afternoon air with a sound that Sarah recognized immediately, the distinctive crack of a bullet, breaking the sound barrier at close range. Someone had just been shot at very close range, and the immediate chaos in the police radio traffic confirmed that the situation had escalated beyond anyone's ability to control using conventional tactics. Radio chatter from the police command post carried across the parking lot with increasing urgency, and Sarah could hear the strain in the officers' voices as they struggled to coordinate a response to a threat that was systematically dismantling their operational capability. The wounded officer was trapped in an exposed position, unable to retreat to safety while the sniper maintained overwatch from his elevated position. Every attempt to mount a rescue operation had been met with precisely placed shots that forced the tactical team back into defensive positions. Sarah stood among the evacuated civilians, her external appearance that of a concerned bystander, but her mind was racing through tactical calculations that none of the police officers had been trained to consider. She could see the building's layout from her position, note the angles of fire available to the shooter, and identify the dead spaces where movement might be possible. More importantly, she could see the fundamental flaws in the police response that were preventing them from resolving the situation. The tactical team was treating this as a standard hostage situation, focusing on containment and negotiation rather than recognizing that they were facing a skilled marksman who had turned the entire area into a kill zone. Their equipment was designed for close-quarters combat, not long-range precision shooting. Their training emphasized the escalation and protection of civilian life, not the aggressive tactics required to neutralize a sniper who held the tactical advantage. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Lieutenant Patterson approached the evacuated group again, his face drawn with the stress of a situation that was spiraling beyond his control. "We need to ask if anyone here has experience with long-range shooting," he announced, his voice carrying the desperation of someone who had exhausted conventional options. "We're looking for someone who might be able to provide technical advice about the shooter's capabilities and limitations." The request hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This was the choice she had been dreading since she began her civilian life, the moment when her unique skills became relevant to a crisis that conventional training couldn't solve. She could remain silent and watch the situation deteriorate, or she could risk exposure by offering assistance that might save lives. Marcus Webb immediately stepped forward, his chest puffed with the self-importance that had made him the range's unofficial expert. "Lieutenant, I've got 20 years of law enforcement experience, including some tactical situations. I'd be happy to share what I know about this kind of scenario." His voice carried the confidence of someone who genuinely believed that his limited experience qualified him to advise on a situation that was beyond his comprehension. Sarah watched Patterson's face as Webb began explaining his assessment of the situation, noting the polite attention that masked growing frustration. Webb's analysis was textbook but irrelevant, based on training scenarios that bore little resemblance to the reality of facing a skilled shooter in an elevated position. His suggestions were conventional wisdom that the tactical team had already attempted and found inadequate. The other shooters from Miller's range began offering their own observations and advice, each convinced that their weekend warrior experience provided insights that the professional law enforcement officers might have missed. Tom Rodriguez suggested that the shooter might be using the scope with limited magnification, making him vulnerable to flanking movements. Sandra Williams wondered if the tactical team had considered using smoke to obscure their advance. The Hendricks brothers debated the merits of different ammunition types and their penetration capabilities. Sarah listened to the well-meaning but fundamentally flawed advice with growing frustration. These were good people who wanted to help, but their understanding of precision shooting was limited to the recreational marksmanship they practiced at Miller's range. They had no experience with the military-grade tactics required to counter a skilled sniper, no understanding of the ballistic calculations that governed long-range shooting, and no appreciation for the psychological factors that separated professional marksmen from amateur enthusiasts. The sound of another shot echoed across the parking lot, followed by the urgent radio traffic that indicated the sniper had claimed another victim. Sarah could hear the tactical team leader's voice cracking with stress as he reported the second casualty and requested additional medical support. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and the conventional response was proving inadequate to the threat. Lieutenant Patterson's frustration was becoming visible as he realized that the civilian shooter's advice, while well-intentioned, wasn't providing the tactical insights he needed. He was looking for someone who could help him understand the sniper's capabilities and limitations, but he was getting recreational shooting advice that had little relevance to the military-grade problem he was facing. Sarah felt the weight of her secret knowledge pressing against her carefully maintained cover. She knew exactly what the tactical team needed to do: identify the shooter's position through ballistic analysis, establish a counter-sniper position with adequate range and concealment, and neutralize the threat with a single precision shot. She had the skills to execute such a mission, the experience to calculate the necessary variables, and the equipment to make the shot from distances that would ensure her safety. But revealing her capabilities would mean exposing her classified record, answering questions about her military service that she couldn't answer, and potentially facing scrutiny from federal authorities who monitored individuals with her level of training. The comfortable anonymity she had built at Miller's range would be destroyed, and her carefully constructed civilian life would be compromised. The moral calculus was becoming increasingly clear as the radio traffic continued to report the tactical team's failures. Officers were being wounded or killed because they lacked the specialized knowledge required to counter a skilled sniper. The shooter was becoming more aggressive with each successful engagement, and the situation was evolving from a defensive standoff to an active hunting scenario. Sarah realized that she was facing the same type of decision that had defined her military career. The moment when following protocol conflicted with doing what was necessary to save lives. In Afghanistan, she had repeatedly made choices that violated standard operating procedures because the tactical situation demanded innovative solutions. Now, in a civilian context, she was being asked to make a similar choice. The difference was that in the military, her superiors had eventually recognized that her unorthodox decisions were based on superior knowledge and judgment. In the civilian world, her intervention would be viewed as unauthorized and potentially dangerous, regardless of its effectiveness. The legal and professional consequences of revealing her capabilities could be severe, but the moral consequences of remaining silent were becoming unbearable. Lieutenant Patterson was preparing to return to his command post when Sarah made her decision. "Lieutenant," she called out, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded respect in combat zones. "I might be able to help you understand what you're dealing with." The lieutenant turned toward her with the polite attention that he had given to the other civilian shooters, but Sarah could see that his patience was wearing thin. She had perhaps 30 seconds to convince him that her knowledge was different from the well-meaning but irrelevant advice he had been receiving from the other members of the group. The shooter is using a high-powered rifle, probably a .308 or similar caliber, from an elevated position that provides him with a tactical advantage over your ground-based response. Sarah began, her voice carrying the clinical precision that she had learned to use when briefing military officers. His shot placement indicates military or law enforcement training, and his behavior suggests that he understands how to use terrain and positioning to control the battle space. Patterson's expression changed as he realized that Sarah's assessment was more sophisticated than anything he had heard from the other civilians. Her terminology was military, her analysis was tactical, and her understanding of the situation was clearly based on more than recreational shooting experience. "Your conventional tactics aren't going to work," Sarah continued, "because you're trying to solve a sniper problem with hostage rescue techniques. The shooter has turned the entire area into a kill zone, and every movement your officers make is being observed and potentially targeted. You need to counter his advantages with superior positioning and precision shooting capability." The lieutenant's full attention was now focused on Sarah, and she could see the calculations running through his mind as he tried to assess her credibility. Her language was professional, her analysis was accurate, and her understanding of the Koka tactical situation was clearly superior to anything he had heard from his own officers or the other civilians. "Ma'am, what's your background?" Patterson asked, his voice carrying the respect that he would show to a fellow professional. "Are you law enforcement or military?" Sarah felt the familiar tension that came with questions about her service record. She had developed standard responses for casual inquiries, but this situation demanded more honesty than she was comfortable providing. The lives of the tactical team members depended on her ability to convince Patterson that her knowledge was credible, but revealing too much about her background would compromise the anonymity she had worked so hard to maintain. "I'm a Marine veteran with specialized training in precision shooting," she replied, choosing her words carefully to provide necessary credibility without revealing classified information. "I've dealt with similar situations in combat environments, and I understand the tactics required to counter a skilled sniper in an elevated position." Patterson's expression became more focused as he realized that he might have found the expert assistance he needed. "What would you recommend?" he asked, his voice carrying the urgency of someone who had exhausted conventional options and was willing to consider alternatives. Sarah looked toward the office building, where the sniper was positioned, her mind automatically calculating angles, distances, and tactical possibilities. She could see several potential counter-sniper positions that would provide adequate concealment, while offering clear shots at the windows where the shooter was likely positioned. The solution was tactically sound and well within her capabilities, but implementing it would require revealing skills that she had kept hidden for 3 years. "I need to see your tactical setup," she said, making the commitment that would change everything. "And I need to know what equipment you have available for long-range shooting." The moment stretched between them like a taut wire filled with the weight of consequences that neither of them fully understood. Patterson saw a potential solution to a tactical nightmare that was consuming his resources and endangering his officers. Sarah saw the end of her anonymous civilian life and the beginning of a chain of events that would force her to confront the classified record she'd had been trying to escape. But in the distance, she could hear the radio traffic reporting another wounded officer, and she knew that the choice had already been made. The tactical situation demanded her intervention, regardless of the personal cost. The comfortable anonymity of Miller's indoor range was about to be shattered by the same skills that had made her legendary in combat zones halfway around the world. Sarah followed Lieutenant Patterson through the maze of emergency vehicles, her mind automatically cataloging the tactical setup while maintaining the external appearance of a concerned civilian offering assistance. The command post was a study in controlled chaos, with officers manning radio equipment, reviewing building schematics, and coordinating the movements of tactical teams that were struggling to adapt to an enemy who held every advantage. The scene reminded Sarah of forward operating bases she had known in Afghanistan, places where dedicated professionals worked with inadequate resources to solve problems that exceeded their training and equipment. The difference was that these officers were facing a combat scenario in their own community, fighting an enemy who understood their limitations and was systematically exploiting them. Commander Richards, the tactical team leader, looked up from a building schematic as Patterson approached with Sarah in tow. His face carried the strain of a man who had watched his carefully planned operation disintegrate under the pressure of an enemy who refused to follow the script. 2 of his officers were wounded, his tactical options were limited, and the situation was deteriorating with each passing hour. "Commander, this is Sarah Chun," Patterson announced, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who wasn't entirely certain about the introduction he was making. "She's a Marine veteran with specialized shooting experience. She thinks she might be able to help us understand what we're dealing with." Richard studied Sarah with the practiced assessment of someone who had learned to evaluate potential assets under pressure. Her civilian clothes and quiet demeanor didn't immediately suggest military experience, but her posture and the way she moved through the tactical environment indicated someone who was comfortable in crisis situations. "Ma'am, I appreciate any insights you might have," Richard said, his tone polite but skeptical. "We're dealing with a shooter who has demonstrated significant marksmanship skills and tactical awareness. Our conventional approach isn't working, and we need to find a way to neutralize the threat without additional casualties." Sarah approached the command table where building schematics and tactical diagrams were spread across the surface. Her eyes immediately began processing the information with the systematic thoroughness that had made her legendary among those who knew her capabilities. The building layout, the angles of fire, the positions of the wounded officers, and the tactical team's attempted approach routes all told a story that she could read with crystal clarity. "Your shooter is positioned on the 4th floor, probably in the northeast corner office," she said, her finger tracing the building schematic with the precision of someone who understood how elevation and angle of fire created tactical advantages. "He's using the windows to control the entire north and east approaches to the building, which explains why your teams can't advance from those directions." Richards leaned forward with sudden interest. Sarah's analysis was more specific and accurate than anything his own tactical advisors had provided. "How can you determine his position so precisely?" he asked, his skepticism beginning to give way to cautious optimism. "The acoustic signature of his shots, combined with the impact patterns I observed, creates a ballistic fingerprint that reveals his approximate location," Sarah explained, her voice carrying the clinical precision that she had learned to use when briefing military officers. "The angle of the broken glass in the police vehicles and the trajectory of the shots that wounded your officers all point to the same general area." She moved to a different section of the schematic, her finger indicating specific locations around the building's perimeter. "He's created overlapping fields of fire that prevent conventional tactical movements. Your officers are trying to approach using standard building clearing techniques, but they're entering a kill zone that's been designed to exploit those exact tactics." Commander Richards found himself nodding as Sarah's analysis clarified tactical problems that his team had been struggling to understand. Her knowledge was clearly based on more than recreational shooting experience, and her understanding of the sniper's capabilities was providing insights that could potentially save lives. "What would you recommend?" Richards asked, his voice carrying the urgency of someone who had exhausted conventional options and was willing to consider alternatives that might have seemed unthinkable an hour earlier. Sarah studied the building layout for another moment, her mind calculating distances, angles, and tactical possibilities with the automatic precision that had once made her the most effective sniper in the Marine Corps. The solution was tactically sound and well within her capabilities, but implementing it would require equipment and positioning that the police tactical team wasn't equipped to provide. You need to establish a counter-sniper position that neutralizes his tactical advantages, she said, her finger indicating a building approximately 800 yards from the target location. From that position, you can observe his movements and potentially take him out before he can react to your presence. Richard studied the location Sarah had indicated, his expression showing both interest and concern. "That's a long shot," he said, his voice carrying the uncertainty of someone who understood that his team's marksmanship capabilities were limited to much shorter ranges. "Do you think one of my officers could make that shot?" Sarah paused, recognizing that she had reached the moment when her carefully maintained cover would have to be abandoned if she was going to provide the assistance that the situation demanded. The tactical team needed someone with capabilities that exceeded standard law enforcement training, and she was the only person present who possessed those skills. "Commander, I need to be honest with you about my background," she said, her voice carrying the weight of a decision that would change everything. "My military service involved specialized training in long-range precision shooting. I have experience with exactly this type of tactical situation, and I have the skills to make the shot you need." The silence that followed was filled with the weight of implications that none of them fully understood. Richards was being offered a solution to his tactical nightmare by someone whose credentials he couldn't verify and whose capabilities he had no way to assess. Sarah was offering to reveal abilities that she had kept hidden for 3 years, abilities that came with questions she couldn't answer and consequences she couldn't predict. "Ma'am, I appreciate your willingness to help," Richard said carefully, "but I can't authorize a civilian to engage in tactical operations. The liability issues alone would be insurmountable, and I have no way to verify your claimed capabilities." Sarah had expected this response, but she had also heard the radio traffic reporting additional casualties and the growing desperation in the voices of the tactical team members. The situation was beyond conventional solutions, and conventional thinking was getting people killed. "Commander, your current approach isn't working," she said, her voice carrying the authority that had once commanded respect in combat zones. "The shooter is systematically degrading your operational capability, and every minute you delay gives him more opportunities to cause casualties. I can end this situation in one shot, but I need your authorization and your equipment." Richard studied her with the intense focus of someone who was being forced to make a decision that could define his career and potentially determine whether his officers lived or died. Sarah's knowledge was clearly superior to anything available within his tactical team, but authorizing a civilian to engage in lethal action would violate every protocol he had been trained to follow. The radio crackled with another urgent transmission. "Command, this is Bravo Team. We've got eyes on the shooter, but he's repositioning to a new window. We need immediate support before he establishes a new field of fire." The transmission broke through Richard's hesitation like a gunshot. His officers were in immediate danger, and conventional tactics had proven inadequate to protect them. The decision was no longer about protocol or liability, but about saving lives with whatever resources were available. "What do you need?" Richards asked, his voice carrying the resolve of someone who had chosen effectiveness over procedure. Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with the transition from planning to action. "I need a precision rifle with a high quality scope, preferably something in .308 caliber with match-grade ammunition. I need a spotter who can help me calculate wind conditions and target movement. And I need access to that building," she said, pointing to the structure she had identified as the optimal counter-sniper position. Richards nodded to one of his officers, who immediately began coordinating the equipment Sarah had requested. The Tactical team carried several precision rifles for their designated marksmen, weapons that were significantly more accurate than standard patrol rifles but still limited, compared to the custom equipment that Sarah was accustomed to using. "We can get you a Remington 700 in .308 with a variable scope," the officer reported. "It's not military grade, but it's the best we have available. We also have match ammunition and basic ballistic calculation equipment." Sarah accepted the limitations of the available equipment with the philosophical resignation that came from years of working with whatever resources were available in combat situations. The rifle wouldn't be as precise as her custom weapon, but it would be adequate for the shot she needed to make. The movement to the counter-sniper position required coordination with multiple tactical teams to ensure that Sarah and her spotter could reach the building safely. The shooter's field of fire didn't extend to the western approach, but the movement still required careful timing and concealment to avoid detection. Officer Martinez volunteered to serve as Sarah's spotter, his experience as a military veteran providing him with at least basic knowledge of the techniques required to support a precision shooter. His role would be to observe the target area, calculate environmental factors, and provide real-time intelligence about the shooter's movements and behavior. The climb to the building's roof was accomplished without incident, but Sarah could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her as she prepared to reveal capabilities that she had kept hidden for 3 years. Every movement, every decision, every shot would be observed and evaluated by people who had no understanding of her true background or the classified record that had made her legendary. The rifle felt different from her custom weapon, heavier and less perfectly balanced, but Sarah's hands automatically adjusted to its characteristics as she began the process of establishing her shooting position. The scope was adequate, the ammunition was quality, and the distance to the target was well within her capabilities. Through the scope, she could see the office building where the shooter was positioned, its windows dark and threatening. Somewhere behind that glass was a person who had already wounded multiple officers and was preparing to cause additional casualties. The tactical situation demanded immediate action, but Sarah knew that the shot she was about to take would end more than just the crisis in the office building. Her anonymous civilian life was about to be shattered by the same skills that had made her the most effective sniper in Marine Corps' history. The comfortable obscurity of Miller's indoor range would be replaced by questions, investigations, and the kind of attention that she had been trying to avoid. But in the distance, she could hear the radio traffic reporting another officer in danger, and she knew that the choice had already been made. The scope's crosshairs found their target, and Sarah began the breathing techniques that had once made her legendary among those who knew her capabilities. The crosshairs settled on the 4th floor window with the steady precision that had once made Sarah Chun the most feared sniper in eye precision. 3 theaters of combat. Through the scope, she could see the faint outline of movement behind the glass, the subtle shift of shadows that indicated the shooter was repositioning for another shot. The wind was minimal, the distance was well within her capabilities, and the target was presenting itself with the kind of clarity that made the shot almost routine. But Sarah hesitated, her finger resting lightly on the trigger as the full weight of what she was about to do settled over her. This wasn't Afghanistan or Iraq, where her targets were enemy combatants operating in a declared war zone. This was a civilian environment where her actions would be scrutinized by investigators, lawyers, and media representatives who had no understanding of the classified record that had shaped her capabilities. Officer Martinez, serving as her spotter, was providing a steady stream of observations through his binoculars. "Target is moving toward the northeast window," he reported, his voice carrying the controlled tension that came with watching someone prepare to take a human life. "Range is approximately 820 yards. Wind is negligible from the southwest." Sarah's mind automatically processed the ballistic calculations that would ensure a first-round hit. The ammunition was quality, the rifle was adequate, and the environmental conditions were favorable. The shot itself was technically straightforward, well within the capabilities that had made her legendary among those who knew her true background. The radio crackled with another, urgent transmission from the tactical teams on the ground. "Command, this is Alpha Team. We have a wounded officer in the open, but we can't reach him without exposing ourselves to sniper fire. We need immediate suppression of the target." The transmission broke through Sarah's hesitation like a physical blow. While she had been calculating the personal consequences of revealing her capabilities, people were dying because she was allowing protocol and self-preservation to override tactical necessity. The situation demanded immediate action, regardless of the cost to her carefully constructed civilian life. "I have a clear shot," Sarah reported to Martinez, her voice carrying the calm authority that had once commanded respect in combat zones. "Target is stationary in the northeast window, approximately 800 yards, minimal wind deflection required." Martinez nodded, his own military experience providing him with enough knowledge to understand the significance of what he was about to witness. "You're clear to engage," he said, his voice carrying the formal authority that made the shot legally justified under the circumstances. Sarah's breathing slowed to the rhythm that had become automatic after years of precision. Shooting. The crosshairs found their target with mechanical precision, the subtle movement behind the glass resolving into the clear outline of a human figure. The trigger broke with the clean precision of a quality weapon, and the rifle recoiled against her shoulder with the familiar authority of a .308 Winchester. The shot was perfect, striking the target exactly where Sarah had aimed and immediately ending the threat that had terrorized the tactical teams for hours. Through the scope, she could see the figure collapse away from the window, the movement decisive and final. The crisis was over, but Sarah knew that her problems were just beginning. The radio traffic immediately shifted from urgent tactical communications to the controlled relief of officers who realized that the threat had been neutralized. "Command, this is Overwatch. Target is down." "Repeat, the target is down. We have successfully terminated the threat." Commander Richards' voice crackled through the radio with barely contained emotion. "Confirm termination. All units, the threat has been neutralized. Medical teams, you are clear to approach the wounded officers. Tactical teams prepare for building clearance to confirm the situation." Sarah began the process of securing her weapon and preparing to face the consequences of her actions. The shot had been legally justified and tactically necessary, but it had also revealed capabilities that would inevitably lead to questions about her background, her training, and the classified record that she had been trying to escape. Martinez was staring at her with the kind of awe that came from witnessing something that challenged his understanding of what was possible. "Ma'am, that was an incredible shot," he said, his voice carrying the respect that one professional marksman shows to another. "I've never seen anyone shoot with that level of precision under pressure." The climb down from the roof was accomplished. In silence, both Sarah and Martinez understanding that they had just participated in something that would have far-reaching consequences. The tactical teams were already moving to secure the building and confirm that the threat had been eliminated. But Sarah knew that the real investigation was just beginning. Commander Richards was waiting for them at the base of the building, his expression showing both gratitude and concern. The crisis had been resolved, but he was beginning to understand that Sarah's capabilities raised questions that he wasn't equipped to answer. "Outstanding work," he said, his voice carrying the professional respect that one warrior shows to another. "That shot saved lives and ended a situation that was beyond our capabilities." Sarah nodded acknowledgement, but she could see the calculation in Richard's eyes as he began to process the implications of what he had just witnessed. A civilian had demonstrated marksmanship skills that exceeded anything in his tactical team's training, and she had done it with equipment that was inferior. to what she was obviously accustomed to using, the crowd of evacuated civilians from Miller's indoor range was being allowed to approach the command post, and Sarah could see the mixture of relief and curiosity on their faces as they realized that the crisis was over. Marcus Webb was already pushing forward, his natural tendency to insert himself into any situation overwhelming his common sense about appropriate behavior at a crime scene. "What happened?" Webb demanded, his voice carrying the authority that he believed his law enforcement background provided. "Did you get the shooter? How did you resolve the situation?" Richards gestured towards Sarah with the kind of respect that immediately captured Webb's attention. This lady resolved the situation with one shot from 800 yards. She demonstrated marksmanship skills that frankly exceeded anything I've seen in 20 years of law enforcement. The statement hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah could see the calculations running through Webb's mind as he tried to reconcile the quiet woman from Miller's range with someone who had just demonstrated capabilities that exceeded his understanding of civilian marksmanship. The other shooters from the range were staring at her with expressions that ranged from amazement to disbelief. 800 yards? Tom Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the skepticism of someone who understood the technical difficulty of such a shot. "That's impossible with standard equipment. Nobody shoots that well under pressure." Sarah remained silent, recognizing that any explanation she provided would only lead to more questions that she couldn't answer. The shot had been necessary, but it had also exposed her in ways that would make her anonymous civilian life impossible to maintain. Officer Martinez stepped forward, his military experience providing him with the credibility to support Sarah's actions. "I was spotting for her," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had witnessed the shot firsthand. She took one look at the tactical situation, calculated the ballistic solution in her head, and made a perfect shot that ended the crisis. It was the most professional marksmanship I've ever seen. The crowd was growing larger as word spread that the crisis had been resolved, and Sarah could see news crews setting up equipment at the perimeter of the police cordon. The story would be local news tonight, but she knew that the details of her involvement would inevitably attract attention from people who understood the significance of what she had accomplished. Webb was staring at her with the kind of intensity that suggested he was beginning to understand that his assumptions about her capabilities had been fundamentally wrong. "Sarah, where did you learn to shoot like that?" he asked, his voice carrying the confusion of someone whose worldview had just been challenged. "Military training," Sarah replied simply, hoping that the minimal explanation would satisfy his curiosity without revealing the classified nature of her background. But she could see that Webb wasn't satisfied with the basic response, and she knew that more detailed questions would follow. Lieutenant Patterson approached the group with the kind of official bearing that suggested he was preparing to take formal statements about the incident. "Ma'am, I need to ask you some questions about your background and training for my report," he said, his voice carrying the professional courtesy that masked his own curiosity about her capabilities. Sarah nodded, understanding that the formal investigation was beginning and that her anonymous civilian life was effectively over. The shot had been necessary and legally justified, but it had also revealed skills that would inevitably lead to scrutiny from federal authorities, who monitored individuals with her level of training. Commander Richards was coordinating the building clearance that would confirm the shooter's death and ensure that no additional threats remained. The tactical teams were moving through the structure with the methodical precision that came from years of training. But Sarah knew that the real investigation would focus on how a civilian had demonstrated capabilities that exceeded their professional standards. The radio traffic was beginning to shift from tactical communications to administrative procedures as the crisis evolved from an active threat to a crime scene investigation. Sarah could hear references to federal notification requirements, weapons tracing procedures, and the kind of bureaucratic processes that would inevitably expose her classified background. Dave Morrison, the owner of Miller's indoor range, was approaching the group with the kind of expression that suggested he was beginning to understand that one of his regular customers had just revealed capabilities that challenged everything he thought he knew about civilian marksmanship. "Sarah, I had no idea you had that kind of training," he said, his voice carrying the amazement of someone who had completely misjudged a person's abilities. The comment triggered a wave of similar reactions from the other shooters who had evacuated from the range. People who had categorized her as a quiet, unremarkable woman were suddenly confronted with evidence that she possessed skills that exceeded their understanding of what was possible. The social dynamics that had kept her invisible were being shattered by the same capabilities that had made her legendary in combat zones. Sandra Williams was staring at her with the kind of expression that suggested she was replaying every interaction they had ever had, looking for signs of the exceptional abilities that she had completely missed. "You never said anything about having advanced training," she said, her voice carrying the accusation that came from feeling deceived. Sarah realized that she was facing the same pattern of reactions that had driven her to seek anonymity in the first place. People who had accepted her as an equal were now treating her as something fundamentally different, someone whose capabilities made them uncomfortable, and whose presence challenged their assumptions about their own skills. The news crews were setting up interviews with the tactical team members, and Sarah could see that the story was beginning to take on the kind of media attention that would make her continued anonymity impossible. The shot had saved lives, but it had also destroyed the carefully constructed civilian life that she had built over 3 years of deliberate obscurity. Commander Richards was approaching with the kind of official bearing that suggested he was preparing to ask questions that would go well beyond the basic incident report. Sarah knew that the real investigation was just beginning, and that her classified background would inevitably be exposed by the federal authorities, who would want to understand how a civilian had demonstrated capabilities that exceeded military standards. The comfortable anonymity of Miller's indoor range was gone forever, shattered by the same skills that had made her legendary among those who knew her true capabilities. The quiet woman who had shot deliberately imperfect groups was about to be revealed as someone whose abilities challenged the understanding of what was possible in the field of precision shooting. 6 months later, Sarah Chun stood in the advanced training facility at Quantico, watching a group of FBI and D agents struggle with shooting scenarios that she had designed based on her combat experience. The classroom was filled with the most elite marksmen in federal law enforcement, men and women who had been selected for specialized training that few civilians even knew existed. They were learning techniques that Sarah had developed during her classified military service, methods that were being adapted for law enforcement use for the first time. The transformation from the quiet woman at Miller's indoor range to the lead instructor for the Federal Bureau of Investigation's counter-sniper program had been swift and dramatic. Within hours of her shot that ended the crisis at the office building, federal agents had arrived to interview her about her background and capabilities. The classified nature of her military record had initially created complications, but the effectiveness of her intervention had convinced senior officials that her skills were too valuable to waste. In civilian obscurity, the media attention had been intense, but carefully managed by federal authorities, who understood the security implications of revealing too much about Sarah's background. The story that emerged focused on her Marine Corps service and law enforcement training, with the classified details of her record remaining hidden behind layers of bureaucratic protection. She had become a local hero, the quiet veteran who had saved lives with a single perfect shot. But the full extent of her capabilities remained known only to those with appropriate security clearances. The FBI's counter-sniper program had been created in response to the increasing frequency of incidents involving skilled shooters who exceeded local law enforcement capabilities. Sarah's intervention had demonstrated that conventional police tactics were inadequate for dealing with military-trained adversaries, and federal authorities had recognized the need for specialized personnel who could respond to such threats. Sarah's role as the program's lead instructor had evolved naturally from her demonstrated abilities and her unique understanding of the tactical problems that law enforcement faced when dealing with skilled snipers. Her curriculum combined advanced marksmanship techniques with tactical psychology, environmental analysis, and the kind of real-world experience that couldn't be taught from textbooks. The agents in her current class represented the elite of federal law enforcement, men and women who had been selected for their demonstrated marksmanship abilities and their potential to develop the advanced skills that the program required. But Sarah could see the same patterns that had defined her experience at Miller's indoor range. Intelligent, dedicated people who were limited by their assumptions about what was possible. Agent Jennifer Walsh, a former Army marksman who had transitioned to federal law enforcement, was struggling with a scenario that required her to calculate wind deflection and bullet drop for a shot at extreme range. Her military training had been excellent, but it had focused on the medium-range shooting that dominated infantry combat, rather than the precision shooting that Sarah's program demanded. The calculation isn't just about the ballistics, Sarah explained, her voice carrying the patient authority that she had developed as an instructor. You need to understand the environmental factors that affect bullet flight, the psychology of the target, and the tactical situation that defines your shooting solution. Mathematics is just the beginning. Sarah moved to the ballistic computer that dominated one wall of the classroom, her fingers dancing across the interface with the unconscious precision that came from years of making similar calculations under combat conditions. The screen displayed a complex three-dimensional model of the shooting scenario, with variables for wind speed, temperature, humidity, and target movement patterns. Agent Walsh, you're calculating for a static target in ideal conditions, Sarah continued, highlighting the flaws in the agent's approach. But real-world shooting involves dynamic targets, changing environmental conditions, and psychological factors that can't be quantified in a computer model. You need to develop the intuitive understanding that allows you to adapt your calculations in real time. The lesson reflected Sarah's evolution as an instructor, her ability to translate combat experience into educational concepts that law enforcement officers could understand and apply. The FBI had initially assumed that her value lay primarily in her marksmanship skills, but they had discovered that her real contribution was her ability to think about precision shooting in ways that challenged conventional wisdom. The program's success had attracted attention from other federal agencies, and Sarah found herself consulting with the Secret Service on protective tactics, the DEA on counter-narcotics operations, and the ATF on weapons analysis. Her classified record had become a valuable asset rather than a burden, providing her with credibility and authority that opened doors throughout the federal law enforcement community. But the personal cost of her new prominence had been significant. The anonymous civilian life that she had built at Miller's indoor range was gone forever, replaced by a level of professional scrutiny that made privacy impossible. Her apartment had been replaced by a secure facility that reflected the government's concern about her safety, and the classified nature of her knowledge. The relationship she had developed at the shooting range had been transformed by the revelation of her true capabilities. Marcus Webb had become almost obsequious in his deference to her expertise, his earlier condescension replaced by an uncomfortable combination of respect and embarrassment. The other shooters treated her with the kind of awe that made normal conversation impossible, their assumptions about her abilities creating a barrier that prevented genuine friendship. Dave Morrison had capitalized on her notoriety by creating a memorial wall at Miller's indoor range, featuring photographs of the incident and newspaper clippings about her heroic intervention. The range had become a destination for shooters who wanted to visit the place where a legend had hidden in plain sight. But Sarah herself could no longer visit without creating a spectacle that disrupted the facility's normal operations. The FBI's training facility at Quantico had become her new home, a place where her abilities were understood and valued rather than hidden. The advanced ranges could accommodate the kind of long-distance shooting that her skills demanded, and the classified environment provided the security that her background required. But she missed the simplicity of her civilian life, the ability to shoot without constantly being evaluated and analyzed. Agent Martinez, who had served as her spotter during the crisis, had been recruited into the counter-sniper program as one of its first graduates. His experience working with Sarah had convinced federal authorities that he understood the level of skill that the program was designed to develop, and his military background provided him with the credibility to serve as an instructor for basic marksmanship concepts. "Sarah, we're getting reports of another incident in Denver," Martinez announced as he entered the classroom, his voice carrying the urgency that came with potential deployment. "Local law enforcement is dealing with a shooter who has military training and superior positioning. They're requesting federal assistance." Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with the transition from training to operational deployment. The counter-sniper program had been activated 12 times in the 6 months since its creation, and each incident had demonstrated the value of having personnel who understood the advanced tactics that conventional law enforcement couldn't counter. Denver incident would be different from the office building crisis that had revealed her capabilities, but the fundamental challenge would be the same: a skilled shooter who had turned conventional tactics against the responders, creating a tactical problem that required specialized knowledge to solve. Sarah's role would be to assess the situation, develop a counter-sniper solution, and either execute the shot herself or provide guidance to local personnel who could implement her tactical recommendations. The deployment process had been refined through experience with specialized equipment and transportation assets maintained in constant readiness. Sarah's custom rifle had been upgraded with military-grade optics and precision ammunition that exceeded anything available to civilian shooters. Her support team included ballistic computers, environmental monitoring equipment, and communication systems that allowed real-time coordination with federal authorities. But the most important element of her capability remained the same skills that had made her legendary during her military service: the ability to analyze complex tactical situations, calculate precise shooting solutions, and execute perfect shots under extreme pressure. The equipment was important, but it was secondary to the human expertise that made the program effective. The flight to Denver provided time for Sarah to review the incident reports and develop preliminary tactical assessments. The shooter was a former military sniper who had been involved in a domestic dispute that had escalated into a hostage situation. His training was similar to Sarah's, but his psychological state was unstable, making him both dangerous and unpredictable. The local law enforcement response had followed the same pattern that Sarah had observed during the office building crisis: competent professionals who were outmatched by an adversary whose capabilities exceeded their training and equipment. The shooter had already wounded 3 officers and was controlling a significant area through superior positioning and marksmanship skills. Sarah's analysis identified several tactical options, but the most effective solution would require her to engage the shooter directly from a position that provided adequate range and concealment. The shot would be technically challenging, requiring calculations that accounted for environmental factors and the shooter's apparent psychological instability. The Denver incident concluded with a single shot at a distance that exceeded the previous record that Sarah had set during her military service. The shooter was neutralized without additional casualties, and the hostage situation was resolved through the same combination of tactical expertise and precision marksmanship that had defined her combat career. The success of the Denver operation led to additional resources and expanded authority for the counter-sniper program. Sarah found herself briefing senior officials about the increasing frequency of incidents involving skilled shooters and the need for specialized response capabilities. Her recommendations shaped federal policy regarding law enforcement training and equipment procurement. The program's reputation had spread throughout the law enforcement community, and Sarah was receiving requests for training and consultation from agencies across the country. Her expertise was becoming a national resource, sought after by organizations that faced threats beyond their conventional capabilities. But the personal fulfillment that came from using her skills to save lives was balanced by the isolation that her unique abilities created. She was respected and valued, but she was also alone in ways that made meaningful relationships difficult to maintain. The weight of her classified record and the expectations that came with her reputation created barriers that few people could understand or overcome. Standing in the Quantico training facility, watching federal agents struggle with concepts that she had mastered years earlier, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her from the anonymous civilian at Miller's Indoor Range to the most recognizable name in federal law enforcement marksmanship. The transformation had been necessary and valuable, but it had also cost her the simple pleasures of shooting without scrutiny and living without the constant awareness that her abilities made her fundamentally different from the people around her. The quiet woman who had deliberately shot imperfect groups to avoid attention had become a legend whose capabilities were discussed in classified briefings and whose techniques were taught in advanced training facilities. She had proven that exceptional talent could emerge from unexpected places, that the most skilled person in any room might be the one that everyone was overlooking. Her story had become an inspiration to law enforcement officers who faced impossible situations, a reminder that human capabilities exceeded what most people believed possible. The counter-sniper program had saved lives and resolved crises that conventional tactics couldn't address, vindicating the decision to recognize and develop her unique abilities. But Sarah knew that her greatest achievement wasn't the shots she had made or the records she had set, but the knowledge that she had transferred to others who would carry on the mission of protecting innocent lives. The program would continue to evolve and expand, providing law enforcement with capabilities that would make communities safer and officers more effective. The legacy of the quiet woman at Miller's Indoor Range would endure long after she had moved on to other challenges, a testament to the potential that existed in every person who was willing to accept the responsibility that came with exceptional abilities. 3 years later, Sarah stood at the podium of the International Law Enforcement Conference, looking out at an audience of police chiefs, federal agents, and military officials from around the world. The presentation she was about to give would establish new protocols for identifying and developing hidden talent within law enforcement agencies. How many of you have walked past exceptional ability without recognizing it? She asked, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had become her trademark. How many times have you dismissed someone because they didn't fit your expectations of what expertise looks like? The audience leaned forward as Sarah clicked a photograph of Miller's Indoor Range, the unremarkable facility where she had spent 3 years hiding her world record capabilities. This is where I learned that the most dangerous assumption in law enforcement is that you already know who your best people are. Her presentation outlined the Miller Protocol, a systematic approach to identifying hidden talent that was being implemented by agencies worldwide. The protocol had already discovered a security guard who was a former Navy SEAL, a dispatcher who was a champion competitive shooter, and a janitor who was a retired Army Ranger. Each had been overlooked by the same assumptions that had kept Sarah invisible. Excellence doesn't always wear the uniform you expect, Sarah concluded. Sometimes it's mopping floors, sitting quietly in the back row, or shooting deliberately imperfect groups to avoid attention. Your job as leaders is to create environments where that excellence can emerge safely. As the standing ovation echoed through the convention center, Sarah thought about the quiet woman who had once sat alone at Miller's indoor range, carefully hiding abilities that the world desperately needed. That woman's story had become a catalyst for change, proving that extraordinary potential existed everywhere if people were willing to look beyond their assumptions to find it. What hidden talents might be overlooked in your own community? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories of people who changed the world by refusing to let their potential remain hidden. Hit that notification bell so you never miss these inspiring tales of ordinary people doing extraordinary things.